Well, thank you very much for inviting me for the second time now to be a part of your really exciting project, ongoing and successfully ongoing project. Particularly this time, yes, I was here in December of 2015, and with great pleasure we talked about the possibilities embedded in this project and in your pursuit. And it's wonderful to see now, after about a year, that things are actually going very well, and that the workshop we are now running together has been, to my mind, going extremely well. With a wonderful group of about 40 students from different institutions, and our colleagues, Fona, Teddy, and Maya, as co-master tutors. Although I don't like necessarily the term of master tutor, but nevertheless, co-leaders of the masterclass, of the workshop. So thank you very much. Thank you also. I just want to use the opportunity to say thank you to the coordinators and the organizers, Louise and Sarah and everyone else, because it has been a really great pleasure to be here. This is immaculately organized. I have not been too many times at workshops and conferences where things were so organized in such an incredible, immaculate way. So congratulations and thank you so much. It makes us feel welcome, hospitality. It makes us feel very welcome, and it's a pleasure to be here. I will talk a little bit about the book and what is in the book, obviously, but I would like to also make parallels. I apologize also for getting sick yesterday, and so I'm probably going to be interrupting this short talk with cough. But I will try to address, as I speak, a couple of things to our participants in the workshop, particularly because I think many of the things that are in the book are relevant to what we are doing in the masterclass. First of all, I have to say that even though I edited the book actually is a collection of 12 exceptional practices. All of them are my colleagues and friends. One of them is actually Teddy. First chapter is Teddy's chapter. And I have been, I feel very privileged, and I have been very blessed to, in fact, be a part of I would say, a generation that initially got very confused with what architecture is and what it means and what it can do. And in fact, for my generation, meaning I was a graduate student like many of you now in the early 90s. That's history, I know, but anyway, in the early 90s. The possibilities of architecture and design in general were absolutely uncertain at the time. In fact, it seemed very bleak, so much so that many of us decided not to practice architecture. Unless, you know, for those who were formalists and really interested in the question of form and really interested in how architecture, in fact, can be used in order to sustain the neoliberalization that started in the mid-80s, which we also witnessed, then I guess you would be happy practicing. But otherwise, it was very difficult to sustain anything that has any meaning, any relevance, at least in relation to the issues I was interested in. And as it happened, many of my friends too. So the book basically, I'm not trying to put everyone who is in the book in my shoes. So in other words, I'm not trying to patronize the people who are in the book. I'm just trying to give you a context of why I got interested in the issues I will talk about today. So the book came out of a series of lectures, a series of presentations that all occurred in a period of about 3 to 4 years. And the reason why they happened is because we were at the time at a very, very interesting moment in time at Parsons School of Design at the New School. And we were trying to figure out how to reframe a design-based urbanism program that isn't called urban planning or urban design or architecture for that matter. We have a program, graduate program in architecture, that would enable students to, in fact, first of all, work in multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary teams, And that will enable students to begin to address issues and questions and struggles and conflicts, urban conflicts, they were interested in, but could not find the venue or the means to do so through traditional design programs. Many of the issues we, the faculty at that time, were interested in. It happened so. Many of the students, many of the young people were also interested in. And as we were searching for the ways in which to structure this experience, they too were searching for places where they could actually, engage in the type of work that was not possible in other design places, in other design schools. So once again, the question was, how do you structure a design-centered urban practice that isn't necessarily client-based and isn't necessarily deductive in a sense in which we talked in the workshop, confirming and perpetuating the type of interplay and power relationships that in fact have structured much of the urban conflict that we have all witnessed and had no means to intervene in. So about 15 or so speakers were invited. As I said, Teddy was one of them. And I then decided to put all of this into this volume. And the reason why, predominantly, my first and primary reason was in order to begin to figure out how to codify this design-centered urban practice so that students, our students, can actually look at it and be able to figure out what can be done and how that can be organized. So for the students in the workshop, the organizing principles. This was not a small task, and I know that by doing that, I have, in fact, put a framework over many practices that are not necessarily ideologically alike. So some are reformist in nature, some are radical in nature. But what I was interested in fact, so I will talk about me now and not necessarily the people in the book, but I will talk about them in a moment. My operating conviction in doing this kind of work and in starting participating in starting these programs at Parsons was that we were interested in the issues of injustice, but therefore socio-spatial environmental justice. We were interested in the framing or reframing of the notion of urban conflict. What is it? How does it emerge? And what can we do about it? And in Teddy's own words, how can we use it as an operating device and not necessarily as an obstacle that cannot be resolved through discursive means? So the first operating conviction I had was that democratic practice is a means of promoting socio-spatial and environmental justice. I am a big believer in democratic practice, even though there are moments where I get, I challenge myself, such as the recent election of Donald Trump as President of the United States. But I still believe in democracy. I just don't believe in the way in which some democratic institutions have performed so that finally you get Donald Trump as president. But that doesn't mean that democracy doesn't work. It just doesn't mean that democracy was not conveyed properly. It's not understood properly. It is understood as a right, in the US in particular. It's not understood as an obligation. It is not understood as a commitment. It is not understood as something that you really need to work on. And as a result, of course, if you have freedom to choose, some people choose not to participate, and it happened so that a lot of people this time who chose to participate favored a particular candidate. That doesn't shake my belief in democracy. But in order to get to a participation, I firmly believe, that's not my idea, that has been an idea promoted by many scholars, Nancy Fraser among others, that in order to get any participatory parity, you need some, at least, rough economic equality. So in a society like the United States, where you have exceptional structural injustice built into the democratic system, it's a very hard thing to expect that you would have people simply willingly participating in society at large or in the decision-making processes, simply because they have been traditionally, many of the groups have been traditionally marginalized. In order to understand how this works and what is the role of design in all of that, which was, of course, my main task. I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a political scientist, I'm an architect and an urbanist, and I'm actually interested in design. I wanted to know what can design do in order to take part in what I called, again, a borrowed phrase, in order to participate in the radical democratization of society. So that was my question. What can design do in order to contribute and in order to structure some of the processes in the so-called mesospace? In Europe, that's a very often used term, or the space of civil society. I am a believer in civil society, even though I know it has a lot of problems, and we all know what the problems are. And I will talk about some of the problems in the presentation. But until I find another thing that works better for organizing the mesospace, then I will obviously be very happy to adopt a different idea. In the meantime, I do believe in civil society, and I do believe that, in fact, in order for design to participate and to contribute to the broader democratization of society, which also means producing and sharing new knowledge, which also means allowing people to understand and learn in order to participate, and so on and so forth, as you will see. In order to do that, I think that design, in fact, ought to participate in strengthening, reimagining forms and practices and processes related to the civil society space. Also, to say civil society, I don't necessarily mean non-profits and NGOs. I borrow definition of civil society, and my understanding of civil society is akin to Iris Marion Young's, which is that civil society actually is a space of voluntary participation, intentional voluntary participation. So it's not forced upon anyone. And I will now make a distinction in between two things that I think are very relevant, also in relation to the Monday morning lecture by Professor Eric Corain. So since Mathieu and Benoit, we talked about what I can talk about, so I will certainly talk about some cases in New York. I just want to leave this image. This is usually the image, the fantastic, spectacular image of New York that people kind of like to see. But I'll just let this hang here while I tell you a few other things, so that this actually is also quite a beautiful image of New York, but of a different kind. What I wanted to say, first of all, is that when you think about a city like New York, a city where 40% of the people who now reside in the city have actually been born elsewhere. So the recent statistics, in fact, shows that more than 40% of New Yorkers were born elsewhere and have moved to the city in the last 20 years. More foreign-born residents. There are more foreign-born residents in New York today than there are citizens of Chicago. The train station, the subway station, the square in front of our buildings, Union Square, has about 2.3 million people on a daily basis go through it, right? So when you begin to, there are 40% live either on the edge or below poverty line. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of languages spoken. Almost half of New Yorkers don't speak English at home. So when you talk about participation, when you talk about inclusion in a city like that, I mean, I can go with the statistics, of course, I can go on for hours, but when you talk about inclusion in that kind of city, you really need to figure out then who, and this is exactly the question we have been asking this week, Maya and I, who are we talking about? You say community. Who is that community? You say, well, the people decided not to participate. Who? Who decided not to participate, and who organized that form of participation? What I'm particularly interested in the book and in principle in the space of civil society. These are actually diagrams designed by students, by the way, to make sense of things. What I'm really interested in is not necessarily the domain of private associations, meaning I'm not interested, and this is where I think there are some analogies with Professor Corain's lecture of Monday. I'm not really interested in community-based organizations that deal necessarily with their own local problems, religious organizations, membership-based organizations. That's less of an interest to me. Those are extremely important, but are less of the interest to me here. What I'm really interested in is the third sector, the so-called third sector organizations, so the associations that happen at the civic level, even though these are not mutually exclusive, and at the public, which means when and at what point can designers help some of the localized issues be codified and universalized so that they can become political claims? In other words, how do you, and this is the question for all of the students will be facing, how do you actually take something that is a local issue and you scale this up to the level where it becomes a political claim? And some of the authors in the book, of course, do precisely that. What the other thing, of course, even though these diagrams are very rudimentary, of course, I'm aware of that. The other thing that is really important is the way in which the civil society, in fact, the spatial civil society, mesospace, begins to mediate in between the state and the market. Under Bloomberg administration in particular, what we have seen, of course, is that the pressure to confuse the civil society, the pressure to, this is the model of neoliberal governance, urban governance anyway, the tendency to bring together a state and the market. I will spare you from the Marxist critique of that, but I think it's absolutely right on. And so, in a way, the vitality and the vibrancy of this mesospace is critical for us, not just to sustain ourselves, sustains the ways in which we practice, but actually come up with new ways of relating to each other, which I think is much more critical. So to my mind, the infrastructure, the whole notion of infrastructure that actually in most of the literature has an essentialist bent, in other words, that is, defined as something without which a society cannot function. So it always has, not always, but in most cases, it has somewhat of a negative bent to it. To my mind, the potential of infrastructure, again, inspired by a wonderful scholar, Abdul Malik Simon, and so the potential of infrastructure is not necessarily to enable us to function. So it's not an essentialist notion of infrastructure. To my mind, the infrastructure enables us to do things together that we otherwise would not be able to do together. So in other words, it is a capability, the building of capacities and capabilities. It is building new civic imagination, new cultural imagination, environmental resources, and so on and so forth. So to my mind, the infrastructure is necessarily socio-spatial primarily, and then also physical and material, thank you, and so on and so forth. So when you look at a city like New York, what you see is that there is a lot of innovation, a lot of incredibly intelligent processes and practices across the city where people actually have organized themselves, no professional designers, where people have organized themselves in order to ameliorate and sometimes transcend the limitations and the situation of crisis they find themselves in. 40%, as I said, lives below poverty line. More than that have no access to fresh food. About 30% has no access to transportation hubs, direct access to the transportation hubs, right? So what you're talking about is that there are basically millions of people who are trying to figure out how to live in the city, not a good life, simply a simple and dignified life, right? So when I say design, just one more definition, I'm sorry to bother you with that, but when I say design, I just want to say, I will not go through all the details. My understanding of design expands beyond the confines of the professional design. So it's not only professional design, although I do believe that professional design is necessary, but the definition of design that I work with is much broader, and I gave the students Monday at least 4 different ways of understanding, of my understanding of what design is, and that's why I usually escape the word design, the term design in general, and talk about designing and not design, because I think as a verb, it actually has a potential to transcend the baggage, the historical baggage that the word design actually connotes, right? So these 3, I will not go to because we don't have the time, but these 3 are just only some of the ways in which the process of designing can actually be broadened to not only recognize the design attitude in people who are not professional designers, those who actually did the urban farming in Queens on the images on the previous slide, but also those where designers, professional designers are those who understand the processes of designing and what does that mean, work with people who have no ambition of becoming designers, but have the ambition to transform the place where they live in order to teach them simply how to do that. And again, a couple of examples I will show you exactly that. So some of what are these? First of all, moving beyond discursive. Community boards, I don't need to tell you. I mean, everyone knows that. Moving beyond discursive, number one. Number two, working creatively in teams. Going beyond what would normally be the outcome of a discursive process, which would be clarifying positions in most cases. Coming up with a shared vision, therefore, right? Coming up with visualizing complexity. That's some of the designers did exactly that. Some designers do exactly that. Visualizing complexity. Codifying knowledge that is embedded in communities and intelligence embedded in communities that is not known to another community next door, for example, right? So all of those things that actually expand the repertoire, if you want, of professional designers, but also enable those who have no interest in becoming professional designers to be creative and transform the place, the place where they live. Transform the city, basically. So in the book, I recognize basically 5. Oh, thank you. Thank you. I recognize 5 ways in which that's done. I will go through the examples now so that I can actually talk about these as we talk through the examples. Building dispositions is an extremely important thing, particularly in relation to inclusion and participation. Building capacities for self-organization, going back to Young's also idea that self-organization, in fact, is one of the preliminary and one of the fundamental steps. The ability to self-organize, the knowledge. And then this may sound a little bit complicated, but in fact, what it really is, and Teddy's chapter talks beautifully about precisely this codifying new knowledge. And Teddy asks the question, if we are not going to do it, who will do it? And the answer is no one, unless we do it, unless he does it. So design is employed as a vehicle for building capabilities, empowering the third sector organizations. Again, I believe in that and think it's important. And then adding 2 capabilities to the government, extremely important. Because the government, as Margaret Thatcher famously said, usually goes with like, we don't have a choice. And that's precisely what Maya was talking about yesterday. Because of the lack of time, lack of resources, and so on and so forth. So it complies with the demands of the marketplace, global marketplace. As I said, this actually is not the typical image of New York City. These are not typical images of New York City, but this is where most people live. You saw the line number 7. Most of the immigrants I talked about before actually live along 3 lines, 3 subway lines, right? So that tells you about the segregation and the socio-spatial segregation across the territory of the 5 boroughs. One example, the first example I want to talk about, and I will time is okay, right? Okay. So the first example I want to talk about is actually by a group of researchers from and designers and scholars from Parsons School of Design that called Desi's laboratory. Desi is Design for Social Innovation and Sustainability. And this is a global network of design-centered labs started by Professor Ezio Manzini from Milan Politecnico many years ago, now a global network. So what they try to do is, of course, I'm not going to talk about Teddy's chapter. I mean, it wouldn't make any sense. And so I will just talk about these 3 New York-based examples from the book. So what they were interested in is community gardens. Community gardens have a long tradition in New York City, and basically the catch with community gardens is that at some point they were the manifestation of a dissent. Most of them were originally organized by people who were in the 60s, you know, the hippies and anarchists and so on and so forth. But at some point in the history of gardens, I'll spare you the whole history, in fact, the city recognizes the value of community gardens, and now anyone can apply to start one. But that doesn't mean that anyone can. It only means that there is a form online that you can access and that you can go and fill out, and there is a process you need to follow in order to. But as we spoke during the workshop a couple of times, what is really happening there is that you don't have, even though you have, there is a form online, not everyone has access, that's one. Secondly, not everyone feels invited, not everyone feels they can do it. So they went through a process through which they worked for about a year, locating the first and initial community gardens, searching the communities and people, individuals who started the community garden movement in New York City, figuring out then how did they manage to do it, how did they manage to sustain it, how did they manage to then scale up so that the city at some point recognized that this is something that in fact is good for the city, and therefore how they managed to in fact turn this anarchist idea in the 60s into now a official New York City policy, right? How was that possible? How did that happen? So they went through a lot of work in recognizing how that happened, codifying the knowledge of that particular movement and practice, talking to a number of diverse audiences, people, actors, talking about what community gardens are and how they are organized. Figuring out, and this is really also, there are some things here that I think the students would be very helpful in relation to some of the things we look at in Brussels. And that's this one right here, retaining cultural identity. And then the other one is taking care of the elderly, which in fact in the US and in New York City is an extreme problem. In fact, what they realized is one of the major qualities of the community gardens is that they were the vehicles through which many communities actually took care of the elderly people. So what they did then is they designed a series of workshops over many months through which they brought all of these people together and then figured out how to put them together to what they call the ideation sessions. I don't particularly like the term ideation, but nevertheless, through the sessions through which they were trying to capture the knowledge that is existing in these practices of the people who were involved in the movement and produce a new knowledge. In other words, if you were to start a garden today, how would you do that? Beyond, there is a form available online on the New York City website. And so what they created then is a series of exhibitions, not exhibitions as to put something on the wall, but exhibitions as sites for the production of knowledge. So again, workshops and exhibitions were vehicles through which this knowledge was produced. Then they created a series of devices, one of which were the maps, and the map literally then is distributed to those communities that had the need for transformation, had the need for healthy food, had the need to them, but didn't know how to get to it, even though the form was online. So what they did then is they mobilized basically this knowledge, mobilized to the communities that did not have access to that kind of experience, to that kind of knowledge, in order to enable them, building capabilities, enable them to do the same thing because it's already legal and allowed, right? The other group I will talk about is Hester Street Collaborative. Hester Street Collaborative was actually but this may be a good moment to say that I didn't realize that in advance, but all of the people featured in the book are architects. I didn't know, that was not the intention at all. It just happened so. So when I realized, in fact, that that was the case, I got scared, somewhat, but also happy. Because in a way, I'm not saying there's anything special about architecture, that get me wrong in that particular sense, but it made me feel good. And the reason is because, as I said a priori, it made me feel good because I realized that there are so many people, particularly young people, who are actually, again, not only interested in this kind of work, but these are the people in their 20s who did that, but who are actually doing it. So this particular group, Hester Street, was actually founded by Leroy Street Studio, an architectural practice on Hester Street in Chinatown in New York. Years ago, and the founder, one of the founders, so the two architects were partners, and one of the founder, Annie Frederick, who started it with them, in fact graduated from the New School, also had, and this transdisciplinarity for you, had a dual degree. New School has this beautiful bachelor's degree that actually has a double major, It's called BAFA, BA and BFA. So she combined sociology and architecture. And so she's the one who started this. She actually is one of the pioneers of this kind of work in the city. She now lives in Hawaii. Don't ask me why, I don't know. She moved to Hawaii after about 20 years of doing this work in New York. She got very tired, exhausted. No, this is an exhausting, difficult work. It sounds like, it looks like a poster, but this is an exhausting, difficult, complex work. So one of the first things they did is a very simple thing. They actually realized that a lot of racial conflict is also around some very kind of instrumental, simple things, one of which was street vending. So they realized that police was, in fact, everyone knows that, after the street vendors, right? So what they wanted to do is to figure out, in fact, how they can turn this conflict into something that is productive for both by, in fact, explaining to the street vendors, that was the very first, one of the very first projects, explaining to the street vendors what their rights are, what are the social, but also spatial implications, where do you stand? Of course, they know it intuitively, but they don't know how that stands in relation to the city, right? They don't understand the complexity of the spaces and how they are related. So what they did is they created a fairly straightforward, but also fairly complex manuals and brochures and posters, where they actually then worked with specific communities and individuals to explain to them what their rights are. And needless to say, this was, I know as a matter of fact, this was, sorry, I'm talking about Hester Street, this is, I'm sorry, this is Center for Urban Pedagogy. I'm sorry, okay, forget about Hester Street, Hester Street is coming. I'm really sick. This is Center for Urban Pedagogy, CUP. Actually founded by Rosten Wu and Damon Rich. So this is, that was one of their first projects, sorry. And this is now another project they did called What is Zoning. If you remember back the, and Rosten Wu, by the way, Rosten Wu is a sociologist and Damon is an architect also. A combination of the two of them, they started this, this partnership. What was really interesting about this one is if you look back, if you remember back those slides that I said I'm going to leave that hang, what is really interesting about this one is that in many, the affordable housing and particularly social housing are a huge problem, huge pressing problem in the city. By very liberal estimates, we just talked about this recently, very liberal estimates, the city, and this is if there is enough money for development, and if 20% is the quota, and if so, and if so. So the city will most probably never be able to resolve the needs and the problems that are presented by the lack of affordable and particularly social housing, public housing. So what they were trying to figure out then is how can they go to the communities that speak a variety of different languages and are distributed across the urban territory and have the income that is usually about 30% of the median income and don't speak English and have no proficiency and most of them have no jobs and so on and so forth, to basically figure out how would they explain to them that they can participate and that they have the right to housing. In other words, they can generate a claim. So one of the projects they did was What is Zoning, that would actually explain to diverse communities, marginalized communities, impoverished communities across New York, what is zoning and what are their rights and responsibilities within this nexus. So they created what they call the kit, zoning kit. They have others, but zoning kit. It takes about 18 months to 2 years to create one of these. It costs a lot of money, and a large team of people is actually working on it. So again, this may look to students as something like, oh, I can do that in a day, but not if you work with a variety of different constituencies and if you actually want to appeal and enable all of them simultaneously. So again, so this is the kit, and what is really interesting about this model of working, again, the New York City has a very complex ecology of civil society, so what is really interesting about this model of working is that they don't have the capacity to go and work with any community. So they work with community organizers. And the community organizers, this is another one, what is affordable housing? So the community organizers, in fact, are the ones who, first of all, understand the need of the communities, but they also speak the language, right? And so they are the translators, they are the mediators. So what they do is they educate and train the community organizers, who then go to their own communities, a number of them, and basically do this process within their own neighborhoods and their own communities and their own parts of the city. And it's always interactive. It's interactive, it's a game, it's kind of a play, performative. But it is the reason why it's there is because once you are at play, you begin to internalize and understand things very differently than if you were just reading a document on the New York City website. And there are documents you can read. These are some of the photographs where you see how they work, and of course there is an online component to it that complements what the participants experience in the actual sessions. This one is Hester Street Collaborative, sorry. So now we get back to Hester Street. And this actually is a really point I wanted to make about these complex ecologies, social and spatial, environmental, extremely complex place, but also extremely complex civil society space. There are so many agencies and associations and actors and so on and so forth that at the end of the day, as some of us have experienced and know in the city, at the end of the day, it becomes, sometimes it actually gets, it becomes really paralyzing. One of the limitations, as anyone who knows anything about civil society and non-profits, and the so-called non-profit industrial sector, is that they all apply for the same funding sources. So in fact, instead of collaborating, they actually compete. So of course, that's a huge limitation. Another one, of course, is they all know each other, and they, even if they wanted to be somewhat antagonistic, but mostly agonistic, there is a lot of touchy-feeliness in that space. So it's very, very often quite paralyzing. This is one of the examples I will show you, and this is actually to the students because that's also very interesting. So this is an example in which Hester Street, in fact, is only a part of a non-profit. They're a part of this complex ecology, and they actually have, in some of their projects, collaborated with the city department, New York City Department of Parks and Recreation, now called City Parks. And in between the department and the Hester Street, they actually also founded some organizations that, in fact, have filled that space with additional capacity. So, Partnership for Parks, City Parks Foundation, Hester Street, and the Department of Parks all work together in order to basically involve as many people as possible through design-centered participatory processes in order to rethink some of the existing parks and playgrounds in the city, Chinatown, for example, but also to imagine what would be, to project, to what would be the desirable spaces and types of recreational activity that the city that the citizens would like to engage in. So this particular one is actually a small park in Chinatown, and what happened here, I'll just tell you anecdotally very, very quickly so that the students can pick this up. What happened there is something very interesting. There is a omnipresent Chinese community, obviously it's Chinatown, but there is a quite robust Latino community there, and historically speaking. So when they designed the park, they had all kinds of elements. They had the participatory sessions, they had design charrettes, they had all kinds of things. And most of the people who participated, for some reason, were the members of the Chinese community, or communities, I should say. And as a result, much of the symbolism in what they finally materialized and visualized in the design of the park, particularly ceramic tiles, some ceramic tiles, actually had Chinese origin. So the Latino community got really upset about it and basically said, we will refuse to attend this park, this playground and park. Which was an incredible, this is one of those things, this is one of those moments where I recently spoke to a chief of urban planning in Macau who tried to create a pavement through the design, in the government design office, to create a pavement in Macau. They took them 10 years to actually come up with a pavement pattern, because the diverse communities could not agree as to what kind of symbolism would actually be appropriate to the shared space, right? And after all, this is my really concluding comment here. After all, what is really, to my mind, what is really, this is I'll run through this, a People's Plan, where Hester Street actually was one of the organizations that led the redesign of the East River waterfront and fought the huge development project that was scheduled, designed by Rogers, that was scheduled to take place last year, in fact. And what they did is that in order to get people involved, particularly younger population, what they did is they created a model of what was being proposed, because you could not find what is proposed anywhere except for these spectacular images. And they took this model, you can see them up there on bicycles and in kindergartens. They took this model across the city and basically engaged anyone they could in explaining what will happen, what is supposed to happen there if we don't act. One thing they realized, of course, is that much of the housing behind this plan is subsidized housing. So the moment you actually realize this kind of plan, forget about the subsidized housing, and most of the residents will actually have to move, and so on and so forth. So these are some of the charrettes they organized, and this is one of the events they organized. I don't have the time now to describe, but along the East River waterfront. And I think what is really interesting to close, what is really interesting to me in this is, I mentioned antagonism and agonism and so on and so forth. I think what is really interesting in this is that the organization, the ideas of how to organize the shared social and not only social space is at the core of this. Enabling people to take part in that conversation, enabling people to do something about it, enabling their visions and imagination, needs and desires to be taken into account, and then negotiating those on democratic grounds. That is the aim of this project. Is that possible? I believe it is. Can some structural injustices that are historically built into this democratic system in the US, for example, can they be surpassed this way? Can they be resolved that way? I don't believe there is a solution. And so this is not, none of these projects is about finding a finite thing. There is no final solution. Also, there is no singular solution to this. There are multiple equally plausible ways of resolving the puzzles we find ourselves in. So in that sense, each of these provides an opening to move beyond discursive, and an opening through which actually these different constituencies can, in fact, begin to negotiate how the shared space, the social space, is organized. That's my hope. So, thank you.